issues.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and Rushanara, please.
Well, thank you very much. So I wanted to focus my questions on FTX and the FCA. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask you a sort of overarching question, having listened to the earlier questions and your answers about this field, which is, if you were to make a parallel comparison, we had the dot-com boom, and then, and at that time, some people might have thought that was the end of that, or the skeptics would have been proven right, perhaps. I don't know if these parallels are appropriate, but just indulge me for a minute. But of course, we've seen e-commerce and all sorts of things, come out after that, and much of which has been positive. Can you see a way through this? And is I'm assuming you might say regulation is part of the story. Can you see a way through this in terms of sort of this industry hits a particular kind of low point, and then out of it comes something hopefully worthwhile and better, or is it very different and not really comparable?
So what I would say is, I think the technology is here to stay.
Yeah.
We already see firms testing that in our sandbox, and I think very much the efficiencies that the underlying technology can bring is something that will remain with us. Again, in the Financial Services and Markets Bill this afternoon, there's the proposal to create the Financial Markets Infrastructure Sandbox, and that will be something that we are working with Bank of England to support. So I think the technology is here to stay. Cryptocurrencies, in relation to the sort of very live events, I think I don't like to predict the future. I think what is very important is that consumers do understand high-risk investment, be prepared to lose all of your money. And I think I've talked about there being some use cases for stablecoin. So I think that what is important is, back to our sort of role as a regulator, that we stand ready to support the introduction. I think the technology itself is absolutely here to stay.
And just another follow-up on the points you made about regulation, and that there's a sort of narrow focus at the moment in what you can do around money laundering and terrorism. Could you be able to give us a sense of the scale of things that have come to your attention through that particular area of activity that you can intervene in terms of the narrow, the registration points that you made earlier?
So what I would say is, in terms of the 73% that didn't meet our standards, that is of concern. That means that they don't meet the standards that we have in place.
So that means that 73% will fall into the category of money laundering and terrorism, would it?
So those would be entities that don't meet the standards that we expect to have the right money laundering systems and controls.
The standards that you're measuring them against are on money laundering and terrorism, is that right?
Correct.
So therefore, 73% of those that are coming to your attention are not passing the money laundering and terrorism test.
They're not meeting the standards that we would expect those firms to be able to meet. Yes,
very
correct.
serious. So tell me in numbers how many that 73% is.
To date, we have determined 258 applications for registration, and 39 have been approved.
So 39 have been approved out of the 258, so the other 258 fall into that category of money laundering and terrorism concerns.
In that context, 10 have been refused, or a warning notice has been issued, and 180 have been withdrawn because the firm didn't meet the standard or has decided to apply at a later date.
Okay. Can you tell me how many of them didn't meet the standards around terrorism, and how many of them didn't meet the standards around money laundering, or are they interconnected?
They are interconnected.
Right. Okay. And how much cooperation do you have with the legal entities, other legal entities like the NCA and others, when you are looking at these sorts of cases and you're looking at money laundering and terrorism in relation to those that don't meet those standards?
I might ask Matthew to come in a moment. What I would say is we have been very proactive in terms of making sure that where we have warning notices, we have been publishing those in order that that is available to members of the public. But perhaps Matthew might want to come in terms of the cooperation that we have with our law enforcement and other partners.
So I just would repeat the point that I made earlier as well, that of those firms where they've not got through, we will then put out a unregistered business list. And of those, so that...
Sorry, say that again?
So we will put out the unregistered business list, so effectively the list that says you shouldn't be dealing with these people, and of those 65% have ceased trading. So I understand your question about, well, what about those that were looking at the money laundering or counter-terrorism? So of those, 65% that we've put out have then ceased trading completely, so they no longer exist.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not really asking that question. I'm asking the question, if they're raising alarm bells around terrorism, that's serious. So what's the process for making sure just seizing trade is not necessarily the end of terrorism financing? So what happens? Can you give us some reassurance that beyond seizing trading, that actually further actions are taken where that's needed in terms of your relationships and interactions with law enforcement agencies?
Absolutely. So, having just come from the National Crime Agency myself, who being head of the UK Financial Intelligence Unit, we work directly side by side, and we have our staff from the FCA in the National Economic Crime Centre working on this particular issue. We also have our staff working alongside the UK FIU. Any of those entities at any point in time can submit a suspicious activity report.
Have there been any prosecutions, to your knowledge, in relation to those that have come to your attention and gone to the law, been passed on to shared with the law enforcement agencies? If you're not able to share it publicly, you can write to us.
Yeah, so I could follow that one up in writing.
That would be really helpful.
So, can I just clarify one point? So for the firms that we reject, we'll issue a warning notice if they're continuing to operate in the UK. But that unauthorised business list will also include people that haven't come to us for application, for registration, and we believe they should be. For the remainder percentage, the 70% that withdraw, some of those might come back to us at a later date to resubmit, meeting our standards. Now, we're looking at are the right standards in place to identify and to spot money laundering? Have they got the right systems in place? Have they been clear in terms of beneficial ownership, geographic location? Some of those, it does not necessarily follow, albeit we have been quite shocked with the standards that we sought to start with. It doesn't necessarily follow that there will necessarily be criminal activity in all of those that have been withdrawn, but it is really important to us that we work in partnership with our key regulatory partners, so the National Crime Agency, the National Economic Crime Centre in particular, and that's why we have the ongoing commitment to make sure that we have FCA secundees.
You just prompted another question on this, which is the ones that are not necessarily engaged in criminal activity, what percentage of that group that come back, those that are not necessarily, they raise alarm bells, but are not necessarily in that category. Is there a percentage around that? You're very welcome to write to me about it if you can't answer that now.
Well, if we could follow that up in writing, that would be helpful.
Turning to FTX, what lessons do you think the UK can learn from the collapse of FTX?
So I think there are a number of lessons we can learn. There are sort of four particular areas, which is and they sort of break down into where you have issuance, and you also have trading, and you also have wholesale, and you all have custody in the same place. That is a significant number of risks that can interplay, which can result in the collapse of a firm. So I think what it says to us in terms of both the international work we're doing and the domestic work is that we need a regulation that deals with those sterile corridors so that we can make sure that we don't see what we've already seen. There is a piece here where minting your own coin and then being able to offer it and then trade it in the same place and then have that cyclical process is a risk for us, both in the UK and internationally.
And if this example is replicated a number of times in different jurisdictions and so on, does that pose a risk to financial stability?
So in terms of, there is a risk at the moment. So we look at the notion of contagion. And at the moment, we don't see further contagion, but that doesn't mean that can't change over the coming months. That's why we're cooperating internationally to come up with a set of standards which looks at regulation for the whole of the IOSCO group.
What's the time frame for getting somewhere with that, do you think?
So it's pacey. So at the moment we've got the end of this week we're in Paris. After that we're then doing the academic roundtable. Then for mid next year we will do a report with recommendations for international regulation, and then that will go to each of the jurisdictions. So mid next year. So we're running in parallel alongside the Treasury timescales.
Can I just add one thing on financial stability? So the Financial Stability Board yesterday put out a release following its plenary talking about what are the financial stability risks as a result of FTX. They said that whilst the financial stability risks to date are limited, the growing linkages of crypto asset firms with core financial markets and institutions increase the risk of spillovers. So this is something that is being monitored quite carefully, the FSB in particular looking at it. And again, going back to the risks that are being really amplified and the spotlight is on here in FTX are risks that can exist in other parts of the financial system, but there is a regulatory framework to deal with those risks. But the FSB has said they're not concerned for the time being in relation to financial stability risks.
But of course we would put out, if there was a firm that we were concerned about in the same way as we did with FTX, then we put out a further warning.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask you a hypothetical. Earlier, one of the witnesses talked about certain countries like Turkey and Vietnam and others where, crypto can, it can really be, people can promote it, footballers can promote it, high-profile people to legitimise it and so on, and people are desperate to find alternatives given their currency issues and so on, all sorts of domestic economic issues. So in a context, in a particular jurisdiction where the economy is extremely vulnerable and so on, and you have a situation like an FTX or multiples of and so on, and a lot of people invest and then lose out. I mean, that can spill over both in terms of financial risk to financial stability as well as wider instability, can it not? Is there a risk of that?
I think there is potential for that, which is exactly why the Financial Stability Board have been looking into it and why already through the FSB there's been a set of recommendations made to the members in terms of aspects to look at. I don't think we've seen that here, but the very fact that FSB have been looking at it indicates that is a potential.
And can you outline why the FCA felt it necessary to include a warning to investors about FTX back in September? And were FTX under investigation for trading in the UK at the time of their collapse?
So we can't specifically comment about FTX for the FISMA confidentiality rules, and I'm sure you understand why. Of course, what we will say is that when we see anything that we can think is concerned of consumers, we'll put a warning out.
Sorry, say that again.
So when we see any activity across the market for consumers, we will put a warning out.
Okay. And despite the warnings about FTX on the FCA website, it's been reported that almost 80,000 UK investors have been affected by the collapse of FTX. Do you think that the warning on your website was sufficient?
So at the moment, the regulation we have, as we've sort of said, it's very, very tight around money laundering. So if we had the wider regulation, for example, and as a payments firm, we'd be able to test more with the UK vulnerability, etc.
So you put that warning up because you were concerned about money laundering and terrorism, the standards that you have to follow, you have to implement. Is that correct?
We put that warning up because we were concerned that FTX could be conducting financial services or products that could be affecting the UK.
Without permission.
Without permission.
Sorry, say that again. Can you clarify that?
We put the warning out because we were concerned that FTX were conducting financial services or products without permission. Right. So when it hasn't got that permission, then of course we are very concerned for the consumer because they will not get the standards we expect in the UK.
And then, given that there were 80,000 investors affected, despite the warnings, can you just give us an idea of who these people are? What's their profile? And again, if you can't answer, if you can give an overarching sense of us, just to understand this better, it would be really helpful to get a breakdown of, you know, the profile of people who are investors, how much, well, you know, what sort of order of money they will have lost. That would be really helpful.
So the tools that we would normally use to answer those questions, we haven't got. So what we can do is follow up in writing by reaching out to other regulators that are dealing with a court case, for example, the Bahamian authorities, which we were speaking to recently. But what we would normally have, we haven't got to answer those questions. So we can give you the best estimate from another regulator's court case, which we will happily do and follow up in writing.
And that's where I think I go back to some of the challenges around the halo effect question, which was raised earlier. There is no consumer protection regime in the UK, so
It needs to be, right?
we're really concerned that consumers don't realise it's high risk, lose all your money, which is why you hear us repeatedly say it's high risk, be prepared to lose all of your money. So even had FTX, even if we'd not put out a warning on FTX, which of course we did, and we did that on the 16th of September, saying we believed it to be operating here without permission, there would still be no consumer protection remit there.
So, sorry, just on that point, just very quickly, just that what we would have if it was in regulation, we'd have a wind down plan where we would be considering each of those people's investments and making a plan so that their reimbursement was properly considered.
Yeah, which is the point I was making in the earlier panel. So just finally, to put it into sort of context or perspective for this committee, where would you put the 80,000 UK investors losing all their deposits in a firm sort of rank in collapses in the past 20 years? And is this one of the biggest consumer detriment examples in that period?
So we're concerned about any single consumer losing their money. In terms of the volume, I can't confirm or agree that volume, but we will come back to you in writing. There have been a number of collapses that are concerning. I haven't got a particular rank that I'd give it, but I'd say it's a lot of money for a lot of consumers that we're genuinely concerned about.
It would be pretty high up in the ranking order if you were to rank. Maybe you can add that to your list of things to write back to me on, or what the ranking order would look like,
What
and
I would say is
where it goes.
It's not good. It's not good for UK financial services. It's not good for confidence in financial services in circumstances where significant numbers of consumers lose their money. That's why we talk about sort of innovation with high standards. If there is to be a crypto regime, it has to be a regulatory regime with high standards. So standards for people that invest, client assets being protected, what happens in the event of insolvency. It's not good for overall confidence to see such events such as FTX, where significant numbers of, or likely significant numbers of UK consumers have lost money.
80,000 is a lot of people, and we had the LC and a number of others. So this is yet another frontier in which investors and consumers find themselves being exploited.
So we're genuinely concerned about any consumer that might lose their money, which is why we use the powers we've got to reach out to the 38 forms and try and get an informed assessment of what we could do for those individuals.
I mean, it sounds like, despite your very limited remit, you are using it as much as you can but obviously it's not enough. So
we've tried to use our voice as much as possible to highlight the risks. We're trying to be as proactive as we can with the remit that we've got. I don't think it's good for overall confidence overall, which goes to show that if the UK does introduce that regulatory regime, it does need to have those really strong standards, because FTX and other examples bring really live examples to the consumer of what can go wrong.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and that brings us to the end of this panel.